Hello, my name is Jared Porter, and I have the great privilege and pleasure of hosting tonight's Southern Festival of Books session. This is In Conversation with Dr. Miguel De La Torre. I'm your host, Jared Porter, and we're so glad you've joined us. Before we begin, on behalf of Humanities Tennessee, a thank you to our key sponsors of the Southern Festival of Books, the Metro Nashville Arts Commission, Ingram Content Group, Tennessee Arts Commission, Vanderbilt University, and Parnassus Books. Thank you for your support that makes this event possible. And speaking of support, the festival is free, a nonprofit event, and donations from individuals like you and from me help make it possible every year. If you believe in this event and sessions like this one, much like I do, you can help it happen. Please give at www.humtn.org. Again, that's humtn.org. First, a couple of reminders. First, Parnassus Books is the official bookseller for the festival. Purchasing books through Parnassus helps keep the festival free. You can buy books today through the links at the top of the chat. You'll also have an opportunity to ask questions later in the session, so be watching for that. Enter your question in the chat, and we'd love to hear what's on your mind. We also ask that questions and comments made in the live chat area be civil and respectful. Festival staff will be monitoring and will remove comments if needed. I'm sure that will not actually be needed. Now I'd like to introduce our special guest. Dr. Miguel De La Torre is the author of, pardon me, let me pull up my notes here. Dr. Miguel De La Torre is the author of Gonna Trouble the Water, Ecojustice, Water, and Environmental Racism. He's a scholar, activist, tenured as a professor of social ethics and Latina studies at Iliff School of Theology in Denver, Colorado. Since obtaining his doctorate in 1999, he has published over 35 books, 5 of which won national awards, and he has some more in the works. We were just talking about that a minute ago before you joined us, and he may tell us a little bit about those later. He served as the president of the Society of Christian Ethics in 2012, and he wrote the screenplay for the documentary Trails of Hope and Terror. Again, he's the author of Gonna Trouble the Water, Ecojustice, Water, and Environmental Racism. Before we start, water, one of the most abundant resources on the planet. It's something that is found throughout the human body. It's both healing, restorative, and also one of the destructive forces that we can encounter here on Earth. It's something that, in many ways is beneficial to life, but again, whether at the hands of Mother Nature or humankind, can be very detrimental to our existence and one of the harsher realities of life. Dr. De La Torre is going to take us deeper and perhaps look at water in ways that we've not perhaps thought of or imagined before. So I think it's going to be a very insightful conversation for those who thirst for that insight. Dr. De La Torre, thank you for joining us tonight.
Thank you for having me. So glad to be here.
Well, let's start at the very beginning with the prologue. Tell us where this book came from. What inspired it? Where did this thought come from?
At my school, I was asked if I would put together a conference dealing with environmental justice. My area of specialty, though, is issues of social ethics, specifically in dealing with issues of racism, ethnic discrimination, classism, sexism, heterosexism. And while the environment is important to me, and it's one of those areas that I spend time in, I really wanted to try to look at it through new eyes. So what the conference did is that we brought individuals who were scholars, who were activists, who were attorneys, who were journalists, to wrestle with this issue of water and how water intersects with environmental racism. The conference was such a success that we put the different presentations together and became the edited book that we're discussing tonight.
And let's talk about, get more into that intersection of water and racism. Let's dive into that and tell us where those meet and some of the findings and just some of the takeaways that you found through the conference, through your research.
I would say that during the conference, 3 major ideas became very obvious. The first one is that the water itself is sacred. There's a sacredness to water that all too often the religious sensibilities of the West simply cannot grasp. In the West, water is a commodity. It's something to use, to abuse, to make money off of. But in many indigenous cultures, water is a spirit in and of itself. And we could talk more about that in a little while, and we can give some examples. The second thing that became obvious to us is that there were rights, not just human rights to water, but the water itself has its own rights. That the water has rights just because it is water. And it's not just the rights of the water and the rights of humans, it's the rights of everything that has life. Animals also have a right to water. So this idea of rights was expanded beyond just the human. And of course, the third thing that became very obvious during the conference and in the writing of the book is that water can be abused to the point of abusing other human beings. In other words, for example, Flint, Michigan. And the fact that the people who have been suffering the most are African Americans in Flint, Michigan, I think goes to your earlier question of where do we see that intersection with using water as a form of abuse towards other people groups.
How did this book change you? Was there something that you didn't expect through the course of your research? Something that has stuck with you in a way that you just didn't expect?
I would say that as I was putting the book together and as I was doing research, what really shocked me, going back to that first point, is how all these different cultures have a reverence toward water, to the point that water itself is deity. For example, among the Yoruba people, the rivers are known as Ochun, which is a goddess, a deity. And it is to Ochun that one gives honor, and you give honor to Ochun by respecting water. So that if I was to pollute water, I am not just polluting water, I am desecrating the deity Ochun. I am creating blasphemy. So how I treat water is how I treat deity. And you have this concept in many indigenous traditions, whether it be in Asia or Africa or within North America. And that spirituality of water, that sacredness of water, unfortunately, is something that Western religions totally miss. And I think we're poor because of it.
It's something that flows literally throughout our history in many ways, unites us. Sometimes it separates us, whether it be through an ocean or some sort of liquid boundary. But at the same time, there's also other ways that it really divides us. We were talking about Flint, Michigan, just a minute ago. Could you expand upon that, about your thoughts on Flint and where we are now? Have we made any progress in that regard? Where are we with this? That particular situation, and do we find it elsewhere?
Mhm. Well, the person that wrote the chapter on that particular um, topic on Flint, Michigan, um, actually is from Flint, Michigan. Her name is Michelle Martinez, and she's an activist in that area. And one of the things that she helped us understand as she went through her conversation, not just Michigan, Flint, but also Detroit is where she's really located, is how, because she is a Latina, in this case in Detroit, living in a Latina neighborhood, um, the pollution that she has to deal with, not just in the water, but in the air, is so much greater than that of other neighborhoods that are not Latinx or Black. So what's going on in Flint, although everyone knows about it, it's been in the news. It's also happening in Detroit, where Martinez is writing from, and quite frankly, it's happening all over the country. So that wherever you have communities of color, that is where you have the greatest degradation of the environment, not just water, but air, soil. It doesn't matter if it's in North Carolina, it doesn't matter if it's in Colorado. And to add a dimension to this, as we, being that we're doing this not live, but we're doing it on video because of the pandemic.
Mm-hmm.
One of the things that the pandemic showed us is that, and I'll give an example of where I live, Denver. In the Latino neighborhood in northern Denver, the COVID rates are a lot higher. And one of the reasons is because we're discovering that poor air quality impacts getting COVID. And because the air quality in the Latino neighborhood is so bad because of all the freeways that were built through the neighborhoods, there's higher cases of COVID. But just 7 miles south in Cherry Creek, which is a predominantly white neighborhood, where the air is a lot cleaner, you have less cases of COVID. So it's not just one issue, whether it be water or air, it's how it compounds with other issues that literally become death dealing to communities of color.
There are things that we take for granted. If we have clean water that I'm just like this, that I'm drinking out of this glass here, we take it for granted, but we can also pollute it and we can cause problems downstream, whether literally or figuratively. And it sounds like that's what you're saying is the choices that we make, the things that we either prioritize or don't, have a very real impact on others around us and potentially even all of us if those consequences become severe and widespread enough.
And you're giving an example of misusing water out of ignorance, that without realizing the damage we do. But what happens when we know exactly what we're doing? And the example that one of the speakers at the conference, and we discussed in the book, gave is that in the Middle East right now, the wars of the future are not going to be about oil, it's going to be about water. That is what's going to be driving conflicts in the Middle East in the future. So who owns the water, who controls water, and how that control of water is measured out into other communities that lack power or privilege, basically creates power structures that can be misused and abused.
And we spoke recently about taking it even further, the global warming, that water has a very destructive power. Could you talk about that in relation to your work?
Mm-hmm. I mean, just this year alone, the western part of the United States is literally on fire, literally burning down because there is not enough water in the atmosphere, because it is so dry that half our country is on fire. While in the eastern side of the country, it has so much water because of hurricanes, people are drowning, and the shores are being destroyed and sinking into the ocean literally. So water, the lack of in the west, and water, the abundance of in the east, is causing havoc with our environment, with our country, with our security as a nation. And yet, while we're seeing this with our own eyes, there were those who want to continue to insist that climate change is a hoax, that there is not a connection, even though was 98% of all scientists say that this is real, and we see that it's real. And conservative organizations like the military are making the necessary steps, knowing we're going to be living in a climate change future. And I probably need to correct myself. I'm saying climate change. Probably the best way of saying it is climate changed, past tense with the ED, because we're no longer talking about the climate's going to change. The climate already has changed. And the issue before us is it too late to reverse some of the damage that we're going to be seeing, or will we spend the rest of humanity dealing with more destructive hurricanes?
It sounds as if we're almost in the eye of the hurricane. It's kind of the calm before the storm, or at least before the storm finishes washing over. And I know that in my own personal life, we've talked about if we were ever to move, we've thought very, very intentionally about where would that be. The idea of living on the coast is nice, but what will be the impact 10, 15 years from now? We have to think about our child and our future, and the choices that we make now. How those are going to impact those around us, future generations. So it's something that I'm very glad that we're talking about tonight. For those out there, go ahead, please.
It's not just the seacoast moving. I mean, Miami, the Miami, it's not just moving back to beachfront property. If you live along the Mississippi River, that's going to be overflowing. If you live up in the mountains of Colorado, like I do, that's going to become more of a desert. I mean, every part of the United States is going to be negatively impacted. None of us are going to be able not to deal with the change in the climate. And here's where the book really spends its time. While industrial nations, specifically the United States, is the major, one of the major causes of this climate change by the greenhouse gases we have emitted, the people who suffer the most are the poor and the wretched of the earth. When we see the Pacific Islands literally disappearing, which means where do these people now end up living if their home is going underwater? When we see the droughts throughout Africa, when we see the more violent storms in India, we are creating a more vulnerable situation for those who are the poorest of the earth. And yet we continue to move forward as if none of that matters.
There will be some who are joining us tonight who have read your book. There are others that have not. Either way, one of the things I love about the Southern Festival of Books and conversations like this is the chance to connect with an author, to go deeper, and to just have an even greater understanding of the work he or she has gone to the trouble to publish. What would you say are the key things, if you could pick 1, 2, 3 things that you just really want people to understand about this book that you have worked on? And what would you like them to know? What would you like them to understand?
I would hope that people really grasp the idea that water is sacred, that water is life-giving. In fact, scientists says we all originally came from water. So it is the giver of life. And for us to abuse water, as the African indigenous religions have taught me, is to be blasphemous against the creator of all. So I think on the spiritual point, and I am, teaching at theological school, so the spiritual is very important to me. I think that's the one thing that I hope this book really gets across. And I think the second thing is, to whom much is given, much is expected. As a nation, probably the most richest and most powerful empire the world has ever known, to ignore this global threat is unimaginable. It's just death causing. And we can't say that we want to be a nation of life when we're bringing so much death and destruction, either by our ignorance about the environment and the climate, or because it is profitable to do so.
Doctor, we do have a very interested audience tuning in. We are seeing some questions here that I will bring up in just a few minutes. But before we do, I wondered, might you have a reading or two that you might like to bring forward and tell us a little bit about those passages? And I will. I'm sure we all are very much looking forward to hearing some readings from the book itself.
Absolutely. So I'll read this from the chapter that I wrote, and I underlined it. So here we go. Western Christianity understanding of stewardship and domination as subjugating nature contributes to the present ecological challenges which humanity faces. The belief that the destiny of human beings is to reside with God in heaven, and that the earth is but a place of sojourn until we reach our celestial destiny, has encouraged, at the very least, neglect of our environment. The greatest threat to the environment comes from those who hold a view of the end times, an eschatological view, where the destruction of the earth is welcome, for it indicates Jesus' second coming when he raptures, takes away from the earth those destined to be saved. If the world ends in a conflagration, and such an end is close at hand, why then worry about the environment? Contrary to these fundamental Christian views, most indigenous religions from the global south maintain a sacred respect for creation, a respect lost and historically abused by many Western religions like Christianity. Indigenous traditions, which understands water as living entities, if not deities, remind us that within the circle of creation, all are equal in value to the Creator. As George Tinker writes, quote, a chief is not valued above the people, nor a two-legged valued above animal nations, the birds or trees and rocks, end quote. Even the stones cry out the praises of creation. Human relationships to creation become a matter of life and death, balancing one's needs and place within the world while seeking to preserve the world for one's descendants who will live 7 generations from now. While one takes from the plenty of creation, something must always be returned to maintain balance. If we are going to appropriate from nature, we must reciprocate to maintain a mutual relationship.
As I hear you read, one thing that just comes to mind again and again is the word responsibility. And by that, I mean both in terms of we are responsible and maybe not a negative, maybe in a negative way, as well as we have a responsibility. Could you speak on both of those? What are we responsible for in both uh, the negative, the consequential, but also in terms of what we really have the moral obligation to do?
I think one of the problems of Western thought is this hyper individualism, in where it's all about me, in where I am the center, in where it's just me and me and me. Yet most religious traditions, including Christianity, talks about putting the needs of others first. So we have a responsibility, to your question. We have a responsibility not only to the others, but also to the creation itself. That it's not just how much of creation I can take and make a profit off of and use for my particular needs, but also how much I give back to creation to make sure that it is restored so that 7 generations from now, my descendants, who I will not even know who they are, can still enjoy the gifts of creation.
As I mentioned before, we think quite a bit here at my home about our daughter in the future, that we will be leaving her, and hoping and praying that it is something that is livable, to be quite honest, and hoping that it'll be something that if she ever looks back, we hope that she will look upon us with favorable eyes, and think that we were part of the good, I think, that can be done to be a good steward of the resources in the world around us. We talked last week about the idea of hope and hopelessness. I was hoping you could dive into that. At this point, you mentioned the word hopelessness. It really is one of the words that comes to mind for you. Could you talk about that?
Yes. One of the books I wrote is called Embracing Hopelessness. And what I try to write in the book is that all too often hope becomes an opiate that drugs us. If I have hope, then it's all going to work out. God's going to fix it, or humans are going to come up with an invention and a new scientific breakthrough that's going to fix the problem. So this hope that it's all going to work out prevents me from doing anything to bring about change, to bring a better humanity, a better earth. I talk about embracing the hopelessness, that we are really messed up here, not to use other language. And therefore, because we need to therefore start becoming more radical in how we deal with this death-causing crisis. As long as I have hope, as long as I have something to lose, I don't have to do anything. But when I have nothing to lose, and I think humanity is getting to that point where we're not going to have anything to lose. This planet is going to, I was going to say it's going to die, but I take that back. It's not going to die. We're going to die. The planet's going to be fine. And in fact, we are the virus of the planet. We're the ones destroying the planet. And it might be, I'm not advocating that for human extinction, but for the sake of the planet, it may not be such a bad idea if we all, go the way of the dinosaurs and let the planet heal and begin life again. Let's, to use your word, hope it doesn't get to that. But it won't get to that if we do nothing.
What I hear you saying is we have a choice. We help determine what the future is, for better or for worse. And that's an interesting perspective. I think that if we don't have a very real concept of the consequences that are in store, a child can reach up on the stovetop and burn their hands because they don't have that perspective or that life knowledge that comes from just experience. And it's interesting to think about as adults. Perhaps we have not learned that lesson.
And now do we have choices? If we do nothing, we have chosen then what the future is going to be for us.
Doing nothing is a choice. It does have a consequence. We so often think that it's, if we're not deciding something, if we're conflict avoidant, I think you're absolutely right. That can still lead to consequences, whether we like it or not.
Absolutely.
Might you have another reading?
Sure. 1 second. Here we go. Stewardship of the Earth's resources require creating a harmonious relationship with nature, as with other human beings. Water is not to be enslaved, sold, or mistreated. To do so creates pollution, lowers life expectancy, and becomes the source of illnesses and disease for those living close to abused waterways. Those were predominantly non-European. The exploitation of the Earth's water and the exploitation of the Earth's disenfranchised are interconnected, making it difficult, if not impossible, to speak of one without mentioning the other. Brazilian liberationist theologian Leonardo Boff has connected the cry of the oppressed with the very cry of the earth. He insists that the logic and justification which led the powerful and privileged to exploit and subjugate the world's marginalized is the same logic and justification which plunders the earth's wealth and lead to its devastation. Limiting the risk of the industrial north is directly linked to increasing the risk of the global south.
Interconnectivity. I read a book once that talked about how you can actually, row in a rowboat down the east coast of the United States, pick up waterways, and go all the way back up through rivers, and then find yourself right back in the Atlantic on the eastern seaboard again. And it's amazing how things that we don't think of as being very connected at all truly are. And we talked before about the idea of polluting the water, and then down the river it becomes a problem. It's not so much for us up the river, but one of these days, does the concentration of pollutants poison us all, or get into the land and the soil, and have an effect on the food chain, and what's being consumed, and then what we consume. It's a tremendous issue. It's global in proportions, I would say. And where do we go from here? It's a big question.
And I wish I had solutions. And I don't want to insult the listeners to this conversation by just coming up with, well, we should just recycle, or we should just do this, or we should just do that. And all those things may be great, and we should do them. But the issues are greater than just individual actions. We're talking about corporate actions. And by corporate, I'm not only talking about groups of people, I'm talking about governments, and I'm talking about multinational corporations. So I'm talking about, we need to maybe begin to look at the major causes of pollution, which is not you and me recycling or not recycling. And don't get me wrong, recycling's good, I do it. But that's not going to change anything. When we allow multinational corporations to continue to plunder the Earth's resources. So it's not just, how do we reduce our carbon footprint? It's how do we begin to pass legislation as a people to hold those who are the greatest polluters accountable for the damage that they are doing.
I don't want to dive too much into the politics personally. I'm not a political pundit, but I did want to ask, branching off of that, where does this start? Is this the voting box, the ballot box? How do we create the kind of change that you're saying is necessary to do something about this? Is it as simple as how you vote? Is there something more that's needed to create real change?
Yeah. As much as easy as it would be to say, yes, we all need to go and vote for the right candidates.
Is that enough?
The problem is it's not only is it enough, the problem also is that as we see the laws being radically changed in states like Texas that leave out the most marginalized people of this country, specifically people of color, by denying them a voice, it then means that only those that already have power and privilege are the ones who are going to be privileged with voting. So it's not that voting is not enough. Our voices are being silenced. So if we don't have voice because of this current political system, this fever that we have, in embracing fabrications about what went on in the last election. If our voices are being silent, we have no other choice but probably to really be more radical in our protests. And how that would look, I don't really know, but if history is any guide, maybe we need to spend more times in the streets.
Before we move on to the questions that I am seeing here, going back to the idea of hopelessness, you mentioned that hope can be an opiate. It can be something that can have the opposite effect. If you think that things will get better, then you may be less inclined to take action. Or is hopelessness something that can spur action? Is that something that you would agree with? Is that even the hopelessness is not where we want to be? when we think about our state of being, our state of mind, is that ultimately a very good thing in a way?
I know that what I'm saying sounds very counterintuitive, but the example that I give is the sign that I saw over the entrance in the camp of Auschwitz that said, "Work will set you free." The hope that if I work hard, I will be set free from this concentration camp was a type of hope that basically reinforced my self-oppression. In other words, if I keep my head down, if I don't make waves, if I don't fight back, I might survive. When we know that was not going to be the case. Not to compare the Holocaust with this, obviously, but what I'm trying to do is see how hope in the past has been used to domesticate people. And my argument, and I look at indigenous people, I look at Asian communities. In this particular book, I look at different communities. I see how those in power have used hope as a way of domestication. And what I'm arguing is when we have nothing to lose, and right now we're getting to the point that if we don't begin to make radical changes in the way we treat the environment, we will also have nothing to lose. When we get to that point, maybe that is when we'll finally become more radical. And in that radicalness is when change begins to happen.
It's not the voices of reassurance if there's a fire in the room. It's the fire alarm that gets us all to safety. It's the thing that jars us sometimes is the thing that really creates change and movement.
Exactly, and that's a good analogy. Absolutely, right now the earth is on fire, and to basically say, well, it's all going to work out. We're going to come up with some science inventions that's going to fix it, and that's not going to help. I think we need to be saying the planet's on fire. We need to stop pretending it's not.
Well, with that, let's turn to some questions. Thank you so much, everyone, for chiming in with what's on your mind and what you would like to ask our guest tonight. I'll go with the first one here is, are there resources, books, or news sources that you use with your students to help keep them informed about climate change and its effect on people of color?
There were several good, well, remember, I teach at a theological school, so the individuals that we're reading have that spiritual bent to it. And there is a whole ecofeminist movement within my discipline and in other disciplines as well that brings the voices of women into this conversation, who also are the ones that are heavily and negatively impacted by the change of the climate. There's a womanist equal group that also is coming up with some tremendous writings. So when I teach classes like this, these are the sources that I go to. And the reason being, one of the things that I'm trying to help my students understand is that those on the margins, those on the underside of privilege, have a better grasp of reality than those who are the ones who are usually the people talking about these issues. Not that they're smarter or not that because they're more brilliant. It's simply because not only do they know what needs to be done to survive in a world that doesn't want them, but they also know what's going on in their own world. And what W.E. Du Bois talks about, this double consciousness, gives them a better grasp of reality. So I'm always looking at the margins of the academy of scholars of color who are speaking not only on this issue, but on any issue to get a better grasp of what's going on.
Next question. Are there organizations that you support or encourage others to support to help reduce inequity as climate change or climate changed problems increase?
I am a scholar, first of all, so I'm doing more the research type thing. I am working right now more on the issue of climate change and immigration. That's the next book that I'm going to be publishing on the environment, the intersection of the climate and the environment, and it's going to be called "Shifting Climate, Shifting People." And for that one, and because this is what my focus is now, the organization that I find myself working with are immigrant groups on the border, specifically No More Deaths, Border Links, Samaritans. These are all in the Tucson area. That's where I spend my time doing my research. And again, it's, how can I say this? We don't want to place all these issues in the neat cul-de-sacs, but they're all interconnected. So the work that I'm doing is the reason we have a lot of Guatemalans on our border right now is because the climate change in Guatemala has destroyed the crops, so they can't feed themselves. And when the agricultural sector of the economy has been destroyed, the people have little choice but to find food for the children, and hence they're heading northward. So I'm studying right now that interconnection between migration and climate change. And for those interested, and they can look at my website, we're going to be having a major conference the third week of October, and where I invited scholars from literally all parts of the world, from the Fiji Islands, from India, from Africa, from the Caribbean, to talk about climate change and and immigration. And that goes back maybe to the first question that you asked about, where do we look for these sources? Here's one place where we'll have, I think, close to 12 different speakers from 12 different parts of the world talking about this issue.
And let's give them let's give them that website, the name of the conference, the website. Where can they learn more?
Basically, if they go to either to iliff.edu and that website, they could look up for the Ecojustice Center, and that would have all the information on the climate. Or they could go into my website, drmigueldelatorre.com, and that would have information about the seminar as well. That would eventually also become a book.
Very good. Next question. Is it true that individual actions don't make much difference relative to the environmental damage done by corporations? I think we've talked about that some, but share additional thoughts, please.
Yeah, no, absolutely. I mean, and I think one of the things that corporate America is very good at doing is it makes it feel like it's our problem and it's our problem to solve, and that we're the ones responsible for this climate being radically changed. And not to get us off the hook, because obviously we all have a part in this, but when you look at what multinational corporations have done to destroy this planet in comparison to what individuals are doing, there really is no comparison. So the issue is not you have to recycle to save the planet. That's important. I recycle. But the real issue we should be concentrating is, how come many of these multinational corporations escape legislation that will make it harder for them to pollute, whether it be the water or the air or the soil? And part of it is because they have tremendous political action committees that pay a lot of contributions to politicians, and individuals do not.
So your vote is not just a vote. It's we need to think in terms of broader, the broader ripple effect. If you vote a certain way, then that can have certain ripples and create change. If enough people vote that way, we shouldn't discount our power, I think, is what I'm hearing.
Mm-hmm.
There's a limit in a way to what you do at the ballot box, but it can also have great power. Another question, very interesting. Would you oppose seeking a middle way between water as a commodity and water as a deity? And what might that look like in terms of human coalitions?
That's an interesting question. I haven't really considered it. I guess my hesitation is will I take a middle way between humans having agency or humans being a commodity? In other words, if I'm going to argue that water itself has rights, that water itself has spirit, can you compromise that? So offhand, I will be very hesitant to do that. Either I say water is an object that I'm going to give it some spiritual uh, definitions or some spiritual attributes to make me feel better, or I'm going to actually say that there's a spirituality here. And if there is, I'm not quite sure I could find a compromise, a middle way with it also becoming a commodity. Now, don't get me wrong, we need to use water. We need to use water for our life, and all the resources of the earth we use and we sell. But as I said earlier, if I'm going to take from the earth, if I'm going to take water, then I have to give something back. I have to reciprocate if I'm going to appropriate. So if you take from the earth, if you if you cut down trees because you want to build houses, then you need to plant 2 trees for every one you knock down, I guess. In other words, you make it better than before you began to take from the earth.
That's a great place to end the conversation. I wish we didn't have to, but we are just about out of time. I wanted to thank you so much, Dr. De La Torre, for the insight that you've brought to us tonight. And it's been just a pleasure speaking and diving into this topic and such specificity. And I know I've learned a lot. I think a lot of people out there have too. Also wanted to thank our sponsors one more time, the sponsors of Southern Festival of Books, some of our key sponsors, the Metro Nashville Arts Commission, Ingram Content Group, Tennessee Arts Commission, Vanderbilt University, and Parnassus Books. Also wanted to mention that Parnassus Books is the official bookseller of the Southern Festival of Books. You can buy Dr. De La Torre's book through Parnassus. We hope you will. And also wanted to remind you one more time that Humanities Tennessee is a nonprofit organization, and the Southern Festival of Books is supported by donors like you, like me. I've attended since I was 7 years old, and it's something that's a highlight of my year. And it makes conversations like tonight's very much possible, and as well as you make it possible through your support. So we hope you will support and throw some donations their way. You can go to humtn.org. Again, humtn.org. Make your donation, show your support, and help keep the Southern Festival of Books coming back for new chapters year after year. Thank you so much, Dr. De La Torre. Thank you again. We appreciate your time, and thank you everyone for joining this evening.